Hey everyone, today we're talking about the Ptolemaic Army, the military force of Ptolemaic Egypt, a kingdom that ruled after the death of Alexander the Great. These soldiers weren't just a random bunch thrown together. They were well-trained fighters, backed by the wealth and power of the Ptolemaic rulers. The Egyptian kings spent a huge amount of money on their army, and during wars, most of the kingdom's budget went to military expenses. At first, the Ptolemaic army was made up of foreign soldiers who came to Egypt to serve. Many of them weren't just mercenaries looking for money. They settled down, started families, and built communities of Greeks, Persians, Thracians, and Jews. Over time, more Egyptians were recruited and trained in Greek-style warfare, creating a diverse but unified army. So, how did this all begin? When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he left behind about 4,000 soldiers. After his death, his generals fought for control of his empire in the Wars of the Diadochi. One of them, Ptolemy I, took over Egypt and made himself king. He found a huge treasure left by previous rulers, and used it to hire mercenaries and strengthen his forces. Because he treated people fairly, many soldiers from different lands wanted to join him. The backbone of the Ptolemaic army was made up of Macedonians, like Alexander's forces. But as time passed, they added Persian and Egyptian soldiers. Since the Hellenistic kingdoms were always fighting, experienced soldiers were in high demand. Skilled fighters could ask for higher pay, and rulers had to compete to get the best troops. Ptolemaic recruiters traveled around the Mediterranean looking for mercenaries. Sometimes, enemy soldiers who were captured in battle were given land in exchange for military service. A good example is the Battle of Gaza in 312 BCE, where thousands of prisoners of war were sent to Egypt and became soldiers. But Egypt was so wealthy that many recruits arrived on their own, hoping for a better life, a chance to own land, or even a high-ranking position. At first, most of these soldiers were from Greece and Macedon. But over time, the army included recruits from Cyrene, Cyprus, Syria, and Egypt itself. The cavalry had a mix of Thracians, Carians, Persians, and Jews, fighting alongside the Greek and Macedonian troops. Many of their children followed in their footsteps, keeping military service as a family tradition. By the 3rd century BCE, more and more Egyptians were drafted into the army, and in later years they made up a large portion of the troops. When it came to leadership, the army had a clear chain of command. The top generals were called strategoi. These men usually came from wealthy families and had direct access to the king. Some led armies into battle, while others acted as governors, managing different provinces in the Ptolemaic Empire. Below them were officers who commanded both infantry and cavalry, but historians still debate exactly how their ranks were structured. The Ptolemaic army used many of the same battle tactics as Alexander the Great. Their strongest soldiers fought in a phalanx, rows of tightly packed infantry carrying long pikes, called sarissas. This formation made them extremely tough in battle. The infantry had three main groups, hoplites and peltasts, who formed the main phalanx, and light infantry, who were usually mercenaries. The army was further divided into groups of about 1,000 men, each led by a commander called a hegemon. One special group in the army was the Macedonians. These were lower-ranking infantry, mostly Egyptians, who served as guards, support troops, and even local police. But they weren't just minor players. When the Great Revolt happened in 206 BCE, they played a big role in the rebellion against the Ptolemaic government, showing how much influence they had. The cavalry was also well organized, with groups of 400 to 500 men, led by officers called hipparchs. Over time, these cavalry units were given names and numbers to tell them apart. The most elite troops were the agema, the royal guard, and the cavalry of the guard. The agema was a force of 3,000 top-tier fighters, split into 3 divisions. The royal guard wasn't just there to protect the king, they also had political power. In some cases, they even started riots and coups, like the famous uprising in Alexandria in 203 BCE. Then there was the cavalry of the guard, an elite heavy cavalry unit stationed in Alexandria. And of course, we can't forget about the war elephants. These huge animals were supposed to scare enemies and show off the king's power. But in reality, they weren't always useful in battle. The Ptolemies used African bush elephants, which were smaller and less aggressive than the Indian elephants used by their rivals, the Seleucids. Because of this disadvantage, they eventually stopped using elephants in combat. And Ptolemaic army was a strong and well-organized force, influenced by the military traditions of Alexander the Great. Unlike modern armies with standard gear, Ptolemaic soldiers had different weapons and armor depending on their role, wealth, and what the government provided. Most soldiers wore simple tunics, cloaks, and sturdy boots. Some had armor, while others relied on shields and weapons for protection. Those who could afford better equipment, or were issued gear by the state, had breastplates made of iron, bronze, or even hardened linen. Linen armor was surprisingly strong and much lighter than metal. Helmets varied, but the most common type was the Phrygian-style helmet, which left the face exposed for better visibility. Officers stood out with brightly colored cloaks and plumed helmets, often in red or yellow to show their rank. Elite cavalry units had extra protection, wearing Thracian or Boeotian-style helmets and cloaks with purple borders. The backbone of the Ptolemaic army was the heavy infantry, who fought in tight formations using long pikes called sarissas. These soldiers wore full armor, including greaves to protect their legs, and carried a curved sword for close combat. Lighter troops, called peltasts, had smaller shields and javelins, but were better equipped than earlier Greek peltasts. Cavalry forces were divided into heavy and light units. Heavily armored cavalry carried multiple spears and curved swords, while lighter cavalry moved quickly and carried lighter weapons. The government provided horses and ensured they were well cared for with stables and veterinarians. Being a soldier in the Ptolemaic army wasn't just about fighting, it was also a way to earn a living. Soldiers were paid in silver drachmas, with the average wage being about 1 drachma per day, including food. Lower-ranking soldiers earned less, while officers and cavalrymen could make 2 or more drachmas a day. Sometimes, rulers even paid enemy soldiers to switch sides, which played a role in the failure of Perdiccas' invasion in 320 BCE, when some of his troops defected after being offered better pay. At the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE, the Ptolemaic army had around 70,000 soldiers, including 11,000 mercenaries and 20,000 Egyptian Macamoi. Historian Christelle Fischer-Beauvais estimated that in peacetime, the Ptolemaic army had between 50,000 and 55,000 men. But during wartime, this number could rise to nearly 94,000. Keeping such a large army running was expensive. Military expenses made up about 34% of the national budget during peacetime and jumped to 78% during wartime. When they weren't at war, soldiers were stationed across Egypt, patrolling, guarding land, and keeping order. Instead of paying soldiers all year, the Ptolemies created a land grant system called the cleruchic system. Soldiers, known as cleruchs, received farmland as part of their payment. This wasn't a new idea. Both Greek and Egyptian rulers had used similar methods before, but the Ptolemies expanded it on a much larger scale. By giving soldiers land, the government ensured they had a reason to stay loyal and support the kingdom. In peacetime, cleruchs served part-time in the military, patrolling and guarding areas, but for most of the year, they worked on their farms. This system allowed the state to maintain a large reserve force without constantly paying wages. The amount of land a soldier received depended on their rank. Lower-ranking Macamoi got between 5 and 20 arauras, each araura being about 2,025 square meters, which was enough to support a small family. Regular infantry received between 16 and 30 arauras, while cavalrymen received between 70 and 100 arauras, enough to generate a good income if managed well. High-ranking officers often rented out their land to tenant farmers and chose to live in cities instead. At first, cleruchs only held their land for their lifetime, and after they died, it returned to the government. But over time, the system changed, allowing them to pass land down to their families. This made cleric status more permanent, and contributed to the spread of Greek culture in Egypt. Many Egyptian clerics adopted Greek names and learned the language to advance in the army's Greek-speaking system. Beyond rewarding soldiers, this system helped the Ptolemies keep control over Egypt. The clerics were often wealthier and had better connections than local Egyptians, making them part of a privileged military class that was loyal to the ruling Greek dynasty. Since they were placed across Egypt, their presence discouraged rebellion and reinforced Ptolemaic rule.